it's very fitting in my mind this week in terms of Parshas Vayechi, which is in some ways literally the quintessential parsha of Jewish continuity. It's really the first time we see the Masorah passed not only from parent to child, but in this case as well from grandparent to grandchild in a very explicit and graphic way. And in a sense, that's really what we're trying to accomplish specifically with NCSY that you've heard a lot about this weekend in terms of the goals and, more importantly, the need for very thoughtful and creative approaches to Kiruv in North America. The situation is complex and daunting. We have very ambitious goals at NCSY to double the level of impact in North America in the next 5 years. And from a Youth Commission perspective, my confidence and my fellow lay leaders very much hinges on the success and really the professionalism that we've seen from the staff at NCSY, led by Rabbi Micha Greenland, who I'll introduce in a moment. But really the full team around him is really something that should all, I think, give us confidence and inspiration that we've got really talented, dedicated professionals looking at this on a nonstop basis. This is something that they wake up and go to sleep thinking about. And it will take that type of effort, I think, to ensure that we can hopefully, God willing, have that same expression that Yaakov had when seeing the continuation of the Masorah from his children of Baruch Shem Kavel Machuso Li'olam Vad. That's really the hope and aspiration that I think we can all look forward to in the years to come. Specifically, Rabbi Greenland was the director of the Midwest region for 12 years, became the international director of NCSY 2 years ago, and in a very short period of time has left a very strong stamp on real growth in terms of execution, in terms of vision and leadership for NCSY towards this very important goal. Without further ado, Rabbi Greenland.
Thank you so much, Avi. It's a pleasure and an honor to have the opportunity to speak with you a little bit this morning. B'shus Rosh Hashiva, Rav Schechter. I think fundamentally spirituality is a recognition of beauty. And sometimes that means, are we even paying attention? Are our eyes even open to the beauty that's around us? So the Washington Post conducted an experiment a few years ago. The experiment involved L'Enfant Plaza train station in Washington, D.C., one Friday morning in January 12, 2007, as commuters were rushing through the station. And they wanted to know what would happen if they put, rather than a regular street performer in the corner, what would happen if they placed a more talented musician in the corner? Would people stop? Would they notice? Would they see what was going on? Would they recognize beauty, real splendor as it was unfolding before their very eyes? Do people pay attention? That was the question. And so they took a musician who was an extraordinary musician for 43 minutes, and they placed him in the corner in L'Enfant Plaza Station in Washington, D.C. 1,097 people passed by. Only 16 stopped for more than 16 seconds. Before the experiment began, the columnist who was putting together this concept went to Leonard Slotkin, who is the head of the National Symphony in Washington, D.C., and said, what would happen if we did such a thing? Would a crowd gather? So Leonard Slotkin said, of course, it depends on the caliber of the musician, but of course I think a crowd would gather. He said, and would he, if his violin case were open, you think he'd put together some money? Unquestionably. How much? Well, it depends on who the musician is, but, at a few $100 at least. Well, the columnist said, well, we did this. Oh, yeah? Who was the musician? It was Joshua Bell. Joshua Bell? Joshua Bell, who regularly plays to sold-out audiences, who a few nights before this experiment had played with the Boston Symphony to thousands of concert-goers with the minimum ticket price of $100. Joshua Bell. Joshua Bell, of course a crowd would gather. Of course he would make a lot of money. Joshua Bell, in addition to regularly playing music to sold-out theaters, also plays on a 1710 Stradivarius violin. The instruments that were put together, and there are only a dozen or so of them left in the world. The violins made by the famous violin maker Stradivarius. Joshua Bell had purchased this violin for $3.5 million, taking out loans in the process. The most magnificent instrument played by the most, thank you so much. The most magnificent instrument played by one of the most magnificent musicians, playing 6 of the most famous classical music pieces, culminating with Bach's Ciccone, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, for 43 minutes, and 16 people gathered. But he did make some money, $32.17. So that's right, some people contributed pennies. But I think this is an incredible indication of the reality that when our eyes are open for beauty, when our eyes are open, then many of us can appreciate it fully. In fact, my guess is among those 1,097 passers-by, there are some who themselves would have been willing to pay $100 to hear Josh Bell play violin. But on an ordinary morning, when you're not expecting beauty, and when you think, places to go, people to see, are we paying attention to what's in front of us? And I think fundamentally, when we talk about spirituality, whether it's spirituality for our children or spirituality for ourselves, and they're certainly interlinked, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, the fundamental question is, are we even paying attention? Are our teens even paying attention? And are we even paying attention? There's a famous Gemara and a famous tour that I think many of you are likely familiar with. The Gemara says that kavana during the first bracha of davening, I'm so uncomfortable speaking about halacha in front of Rav Shechter, so I hope Rav Shechter will correct me if I say anything incorrect. But the Gemara says that the first kavana, appropriate attention, recognition, zoning in to what we're really accomplishing. What do the words mean? Are we in front of the Ribono Shel Olam? We're really talking to the Master of the Universe, the King of Kings. Kavana during the first bracha of Shmona Esrei is a non-negotiable. It's critical. The Gemara and then Rashi there explains that for that bracha, that if you don't have kavana for that bracha, you're supposed to actually go back and repeat it again. So the Tur brings down this Gemara and says that even though the Gemara in fact says that when you don't have kavanah during the first bracha of Shmona Esrei, you're supposed to go back and repeat the first bracha again, this time like you really mean it. But the Tur says, Bizman hazeh, in our times, that we have so much trouble with kavanah, there are no guarantees that you'll have kavanah the second time through either. No guarantees that you'll have kavanah the second time either. So he paskins the halacha differently, is that you're not supposed to go back and repeat. The Tur, writing in the early 1300s, 700 years ago, we, in our times, where kavanah is weak. So if we think spirituality and focus on kavanah is a new problem, then we're sorely mistaken. The Tur wrote about this 700 years ago. The problem is only compounded in our days. But focusing on spirituality, even recognizing that we're talking to God when we're actually supposed to be having a conversation with Him during Shmona Esrei, right in front of our very eyes, that was a challenge that was struggled with for centuries. Reb Chaim Brisker was famously asked the question, I think it was Reb Chaim Brisker, was famously asked the question, when does parenting begin? A prospective father was asking him this question, I'm about to have my first child. When does parenting begin? When am I supposed to start chinuch? Does it start a month after the baby's born, a year after the baby's born, maybe when they're 5? When does chinuch really start? And Reb Chaim answered, chinuch begins 20 years before the baby's born. Which really underscores what I think is the fundamental concept, that as parents, all of us, need to recognize that it's not about our kids. It's about us. And the strategies that we employ and the approaches that we take and how our own spirituality is first and foremost on our minds, and that in turn will determine what the outcomes are for our kids. I'm going to give some other strategies. Organizations like NCSY can help also. But in our communities, in our homes, I think fundamentally it is about finding ways to make spirituality, to make beauty that we could behold before our very eyes on an ongoing basis, to make that first and foremost on our minds on a regular basis. So some strategies, let's speak about that a little bit. So as I've touched on, the first strategy is modeling the behaviors ourselves. Demonstrating to our kids, to our children, that we care about spirituality. Spirituality means a meaningful connection with God. And often in Judaism, God is absent from the conversation. In Christianity, not so much. Christians are very comfortable talking about God. They bring God into every conversation, or, a relative of his, so to speak. But we don't bring God into the conversation, not often enough. We don't talk about, when we're talking about prayer, we don't talk about that it's actually about God. There's an incredible mashal that a mentor of mine in Tefillah, Rabbi Yoshua Karsh in Chicago, who does outreach and focuses, his area of expertise is Tefillah. He wrote a magnificent essay, I'll call it. It's about 25 pages, and if you Google it, you can find it. Davening on it's called Davening on Hot Coals. How to pray like you really mean it. And Rabbi Karsh develops a mashal, a parable, about somebody that he calls Uncle Lou. I'm going to tell over this parable as if I have an Uncle Lou, which I don't. So I'm going to emphasize at the beginning, I'll probably emphasize again later, that this is entirely fictional. But let's think for a minute about our Uncle Lou. About my Uncle Lou. I grew up with parents of ordinary means. Mother was a school teacher, a father who does data entry. Again, this is fictional too. And my mother earned a modest salary, my father earned a modest salary, and yet I never lacked for anything. My private day school education was paid for. The clothes on my back, I always had nice clothes. We went away together as a family on nice vacations. We lived in a beautiful home. My parents each had a nice car. I never lacked for anything in my life. Anything I wanted, I needed. Anything I wanted, I got, more or less within reason. Anything I needed, I for sure got. And from the moment I was old enough to be sensitive to this question, I started to wonder, how is this all possible? My mother and her modest salary, my father and his modest salary, how is it all working out that all of our needs are provided for? We never lack for anything. My affluent friends also never lack for anything, but I see why that is. But we never lack for anything either. It gnawed at me my entire upbringing. Another thing, though, gnawed at me my entire upbringing. And it was that at every family simcha, my parents had this very frustrating habit of forcing me into conversations with my very awkward Uncle Lou. Every time we were at a simcha, there was Uncle Lou in the corner, and he would come up to me and say, "Here we go again. Micah. My parents call me different names. Micha, that would be my mother, or Micah, that would be my father. Go talk to Uncle Lou. Talk to Uncle Lou again. He's so awkward. Uncle Lou would come over, say, "How are you?" "I'm fine." "How's school?" The conversation would always feel like it went on too long. I never knew what to say. I never knew why my parents were so awkwardly forcing me into this dynamic of a relationship with an Uncle Lou that I never really felt a connection with. I never really felt that he had anything meaningful to say to me, and I certainly had nothing meaningful to say to him. But at some point after I graduated high school, my parents sat me down and they said, let us tell you a little bit about your Uncle Lou. Your Uncle Lou has been single-handedly financing every single blessing that you have in your life. Your Uncle Lou has been providing you the clothes on your back, the education that you hold so near and dear, the house that we live in, the cars that we drive, every single blessing that you have in your life, every single need or want that's been taken care of since the day you were born, it is all Uncle Lou. You better believe that the next time I see Uncle Lou at a family simcha, the dynamic in my mind at least is going to change. Because I'm going to look at Uncle Lou not as this awkward man that I have nothing to say, to whom I have nothing to say, and that I'm not sure why he has anything to say to me. But instead, I'm going to look at Uncle Lou as truly the benefactor that he is, who's looked after my every need, my every desire, my every want. Now, it's still going to be awkward because I've never built a relationship with him. So I'm still not going to know exactly what to say. He's probably going to say the same things, but I'm not going to know exactly what to say. It's going to be awkward. But if I work at it, I'm pretty confident that through that work, I'll build a relationship because he's sure as anything been looking after me. So all I need to do is recognize that first and foremost and then say, I crave a relationship with Uncle Lou. To express hakaras hatov, maybe even to ask for things, because how is Uncle Lou going to know what I want the next time? To praise him, to express my thanks. That's the Uncle Lou analogy that Rabbi Karsh speaks about. And obviously it relates directly to the way we think about God, who anticipates our every need, who takes care of our every want within reasonable parameters, but that we always have this weird Uncle Lou-like dynamic with. We're not sure what to say to him, and we're not sure why he wants to talk to us, or can even process what he's trying to say if the messages are even there. But that's tefillah. And we don't often talk with our kids or relate to it ourselves as the way to actually form a relationship with God, as if there is an actual being that we can develop a relationship with. And all relationships are difficult. Our relationships with our children require work. Our relationships with our spouse require work. Our relationships with our friends require work, and with relatives require work. Why should our relationship with God be so simple? We think it's supposed to just happen easily? It doesn't work that way. You have to work at a relationship. And the words of the siddur are the tool, not the ceiling of what our prayer could express, but the floor. We could say anything we want in prayer, express any desire, any want, any expression of gratitude. But it starts with a mindset of we're actually talking to the King of Kings, our Father in heaven, who loves us, who cares about us, who sees to our every need. It's hard enough for us as adults to think about tefillah that way. That as we take those 3 steps forward to begin Shmona Esrei, that we're actually standing before the King of Kings. But Kal v'chomer, how much more so it is for our children, whose davening is policed by proctors in school, walking around, grading whether they're actually having kavanah or not. What does kavanah look like to a proctor, I wonder? But the language of how we talk to our kids about tefillah needs to start with our modeling it ourselves. Do we talk about God? Do we talk about when we're about to daven? Do our kids see that we're actually working to build a relationship with God? They're watching. Boy, are they watching everything that we do. When we sing Zmirus at the Shabbos table, when we bench, do we actually demonstrate that we're forging a meaningful and honest spiritual connection with our Creator, with the King of Kings, with our Father in heaven, the Master of the universe? So it starts, I think, with the mindset, bringing God into the conversation and modeling it to our children. That's one. A second strategy. Second strategy is, I think, thinking outside the spiritual box. We all, Baruch Hashem, take vacations with our children. We all, Baruch Hashem, have opportunities to introduce spirituality into the conversation. We're creative often in our business lives, in our professional lives. We're thinking, how can we do something really interesting? How can we change up the dynamic a little bit in our business lives, in our professional lives? We're thinking along those lines on a regular basis. But how often do we think about that as it relates to our Shabbos table or as it relates to our vacations? So many of us, thank God, we take our kids on a vacation to Israel and we think, okay, so that isn't that enough? And in many ways it is. In many ways, the rest of it does, to an extent, take care of itself. But what are we doing with our kids when we take vacations in Israel? We're just visiting family, which is important and nice. Are we going to see the sights, which is important and nice? Or are we also finding ways to do something that actually emanates from the kids themselves? Are we going to a food pantry to actually involve our kids in real ma'aseh chesed? Are we going down to communities where people are not as privileged as we are financially? Reaching out through programs that even OU Israel has in Israel, Makom Balev, going to places like Lud and Ramla and seeing what it's like for the people in those communities. Where we run programs, we meaning OU Israel, run programs in those communities for immigrant children coming from Russia, coming from Ethiopia, coming from countries where they don't have the financial wherewithal to do all the things that we have the opportunity to do with our kids. And because socioeconomically in those communities, those Israeli kids are more similar to Palestinian children than they are socioeconomically to the Jewish children in Tel Aviv and in Ra'anana and in Yerushalayim. Assimilation is rampant. Intermarriage even is rampant. Where those kids, if we don't get them to Jewish high schools, they're going to be on their way towards dating Arabs, marrying, Rahman al-Islam, Arabs. That's its own problem. But we can do something for our own kids by sensitizing them to these circumstances. There are people who are less fortunate than us. How do we do chesed like we really mean it? How do we do outreach like we really mean it? Bringing our kids along on these excursions, taking half a day on an experience that, Baruch Hashem, we go for a week or 2 or 3, taking a half a day and going to a food pantry, a soup kitchen, a Makom Balev program in Ramla or Lud or another socioeconomically challenged community. What are we doing that's outside the box to wake our kids up to the reality that they're part of a world that they can connect to and feel like I'm somebody? More than that, what sort of creativity do we put into our Shabbos table? Does our Shabbos table literally look the same way it did 5 years ago and 10 years ago and 15 years ago and 20 years ago? For many of us, it looks exactly the same because it's comfortable. And listen, Shabbos is incredible. So Shabbos on its own, if we have a great Shabbos table where we sing one zemer and we talk about the politics of the week, maybe a little Lashon Hara, hopefully no Lashon Hara, but that's the dynamic in most of our Shabbos tables, certainly, and mine even. And that's because we're not thinking outside the spiritual box. What can we do that's going to change the dynamic? If our kids prepare Divrei Torah automatically, because we've been doing that every week at our Shabbos table, what can we do to change the dynamic? Can an older sibling teach the Dvar Torah to a younger sibling? Have the younger sibling say it at the Shabbos table? And have a sense of pride that Torah is shared between siblings at our Shabbos table? If we don't really regularly sing Zmiros, so what Zemer are we going to sing this week? Leave it up to the kids. Have them think on Erev Shabbos about what the Zmiros are going to look like at this Shabbos table. Even have a rotating agenda, written or not, for the Shabbos table conversation. And have one child a week, depending on the age of the children, say, what are we going to talk about? A matter of importance to the Jewish community that we're going to talk about at our Shabbos table. It makes Shabbos more meaningful, and it makes what we're so good at, I think, in NCSY is that we make kids feel like they are on par with adults. They are owners in the world instead of bystanders in the world. That they can own these conversations, these decisions. The Zmiros that they sing, the Divrei Torah that they share, that it means something to us. And whether every experiment works or doesn't work, and certainly not every experiment will work, and certainly not every experiment that might work in one household is going to work in every household. But just the fact that we cared enough to think creatively is enough. I remember one Friday night, when I say enough, I mean it's enough to send the message to our kids that we care. And what we care about, whether they say it or not, express it or not, means a lot to our kids. They're watching, they're paying attention, 24/7, recorded camera all the time. One Friday night, this doesn't happen often enough for any of us, right? One Friday night I was feeling particularly inspired during Kabbalah Shabbos. It was a magnificent davening. I have to say, I really felt like, as opposed to so many times we feel like, I don't know who I was talking to, I actually felt like I was talking to the Ribono Shel Olam. I actually felt Shabbos come in during L'Chadodi. It was magnificent. And that doesn't happen often enough to us adults. But when it does, we better seize the moment. I walked home, came into the dining room, and we all gathered around the Shabbos table. When I started singing Shalom Aleichem, I don't know what got into me, but it was definitely the residual of that Kabbalah Shabbos. I grabbed one son's hand and one daughter's hand, said, we're dancing around the table for Shalom Aleichem. And they said, Abba, you're so awkward. And they laughed about it. And they were reluctant participants. But I watched how they told their friends about it the next day. And they weren't just making fun of their father. They were proud. They thought it was cool. Kind of. Cool enough that it showed them that something was different that Friday night. And they bring it up periodically. It was like 2-3 years ago. They bring it up periodically. Abba, who danced during Shalom Aleichem one time. So I don't think my kids are the kind of kids that want to dance during Shalom Aleichem every Friday night. I don't think I'm going to feel it genuinely and passionately every Friday night. But when you do, when you're feeling spiritually connected, don't be ashamed to let your kids see that. Don't be ashamed to actually plan it out on your way home from shul or to plan out these strategies well in advance. So that's the second tactic, is to be thinking outside the box, to actually employ some of the creativity that we express in our business lives, in our spiritual lives, our business lives and our professional lives, into our spiritual lives. When we go out on a date with our spouses, which hopefully we all do periodically, and obviously, in my case, not often enough, but if we do that, let's employ during that time together, take a few minutes and say, what can we do for our kids spiritually? Instead of just talking about, again, the politics or what's going on in the world or the challenges we're having with our kids and being responsive instead of proactive to those challenges. So-and-so needs this therapy and so-and-so's challenged this way in school, and boy, the note I got from this teacher. Let's think proactively. What could our Shabbos table look like this Friday night that's different? What could our conversation about davening look like this week that's different? I think Shabbos and davening are good areas to start with. Chesed is a good other area. Because it turns the chesed, like nothing else, turns our kids into owners instead of just bystanders. The national president of NCSY, I just came from Yarchei Kala. National Yarchei Kala, I would have been here for Shabbos if I wasn't there. National Yarchei Kala in Stamford, Connecticut was a magnificent experience with over 300 teenagers learning Torah together intensively for 4 days. They're still finishing over there as I'm here with you this morning. And during National Yarchei Kala, you have an opportunity. It's 80-90% public school students, only about 10-20% day school students. And you have the opportunity to see kids who are just open, they're not tarnished by having experiences through their youth of having their davening proctored, for example. And so when you talk to them about tefillah, they can actually start, it's like a blank slate. You're starting from the beginning. You could talk about tefillah in a way that it actually frames the conversation in ways that they can relate to. But this is another strategy. And I'll demonstrate it by way of example. Our national president of NCSY this year is a young woman named Tova Sklar from Teaneck, New Jersey, or from Bergenfield. She's a terrific woman, a 12th grade student at Mayanot, and a really fine example of a leader. She told me that her first experience at NCSY, when I was interviewing her to be national president, she told me her first experience in NCSY was a chesed experience. It was an experience where Katz, who today is the New Jersey NCSY regional director, at the time was associate regional director, has developed these chesed missions where we in NCSY take high school students in partnership between NCSY and the high school down to New Orleans in this case, to other places that there is there's an organization based out of Minnesota that does these tikkun olam missions, disaster relief missions for Jewish people to help Jews and non-Jews recover from disasters. And in this case, Rabbi Eitan Katz has been running disaster relief missions together with TABC students, with Mayanot students, for a number of years. And Tova Sklar, who had never come to an NCSY event as a participant in her life, came as a Mayanot student on a mission to New Orleans, and was blown away by the opportunity that she had as a 9th or 10th grader to make a real difference in the world. And after that, she said, I have to be involved in NCSY where I can do more of this. And the rest, well, the history is still unfolding, but so far, the rest is history. Now she's the national president of NCSY, who, when she got up to speak at Shalosh Shudas yesterday, with 315 pairs of teenage eyes looking at her as their role model, somebody that they want to learn from, was extraordinary. I thought her first activity in NCSY as a participant, and it was 9th, 10th grade. But she said yesterday she told the story about how she actually started in NCSY. Her first encounter with NCSY came far before that, long before that. She wasn't a participant. In fact, she was in 4th grade, younger than any of the participants in NCSY. And it was at National Yarchei Kala 8 years ago, as a 4th grade student, that she was just davening in Keter Torah in Romer, where for many of the past several years, NCSY's Yarchei Kala, while we've been in the Stamford Hilton during the week, we come to Teaneck for Shabbos and stay in homes in the neighborhood and have had davening over Shabbos and the program over Shabbos at Romer at Keter Torah. And there she was, in the Ezras Nashim, in the women's section in Romer, blown away by the Ruach, blown away by all the singing, blown away by these hundreds of people who had come from all over the country to experience Shabbos, many of them for the first time. But what really blew her away, she said yesterday, was the following. She saw, as the Gabbai was calling up high school kids for the Aliyot, and there was one who came up, and the Gabbai asked him, do you know the blessing? And he said, no. And she's witnessing this. And he said, have you ever had an Aliyah? And he said, no. So an advisor came up and said, I'll help you with the Aliyah. And a regional director who was also standing there said, wait. And he stood up and made an announcement to the entire shul. Because he said, usually, a young man has his bar mitzvah when he turns 13, and that's the first time he's called to the Torah. But it's never too late to have a bar mitzvah. It's never too late to accept the yoke of Torah mitzvos upon ourselves. It's never too late to be called to the Torah for the first time. And here we have Anthony, this young man who came from the former Soviet Union, and whose parents were not sensitive, even though he was here when he was 13, didn't connect the dots, didn't provide him that opportunity. And here he's going to be called to the Torah for the first time. And the advisor helped this young man with the bracha, and everybody sang Siman Tov Mazel Tov and danced, and it was magnificent. The bar mitzvah in Romer, right there in Teaneck, in Bergenfield, Teaneck, for this young man who at 17 was being called to the Torah for the first time. And it was great, and I'm sure many people there were inspired, but I wouldn't have thought necessarily that one of them was a 4th grade girl. I wouldn't have thought necessarily that that was the inspiration, that was the spark that would be lit. That then Tova Sklar sitting there that day would say, I want to be part of this organization one day. And now she's a leader in this organization, the teen leader in the organization. And I think it's because somebody had the opportunity, somebody had the forethought to connect those dots at that moment. But more globally, what sorts of experiences do we introduce our kids to that can get them to expand their horizons? NCSY summer programs are among them. Camp experiences are certainly also among them, NCSY or otherwise. Any opportunity to develop a role model relationship with somebody who's not just their parents, somebody who's not just us, somebody who can embrace them unconditionally, love them for who they are, not also have to be an enforcer. Because we love our kids unconditionally, but we also have to be enforcers. And teachers and principals, who I think are part of the solution. They're not part of the problem. In many cases, they also love our kids unconditionally, but they also have to be enforcers. It's so much easier in an environment like NCSY or a camp or another youth group to have the opportunity to have our kids, A, be accepted unconditionally for who they are, really gotten to know, loved, and not judged, and also have their horizons expanded, where they get to meet kids from different backgrounds in an appropriately supervised miskeret, in an appropriately supervised structure, to get to expand their horizons, to see how the other side lives. And the other side can mean the other side of the country, the other side of the universe, the other side of the socioeconomic spectrum, the other side of the religious spectrum. Kids who are more religious than them, less religious than them, come from different backgrounds. So I think that's the third strategy that we as parents can employ. To recap, those strategies are, number one, do we bring God into the conversation? Do we model this type of behavior ourselves? Are we excited? Or are we just schlepping through? Ramosha Feinstein, I'm sure you've heard this story, but I'll repeat it because it's worth thinking about freshly. Ramosha Feinstein was famously asked the question, what happened to all those Jews, those families who were Moser Nefesh for Shabbos in the 20s, 30s, 40s in America, who quit their job every Friday afternoon and had to start looking for a new job on Sunday morning? What? We don't have Mesiras Nefesh for Shabbos today like they had then. And yet our kids predominantly are frum, and their kids predominantly were not. So how does that happen? How does the example of Mesiras Nefesh that parents were setting in those days, how does it happen that then their kids are not interested? And Ramosha Feinstein famously explained, he said, it's because when they get home on Friday night, they slump down in their chair and they say, Shver zu sein a Yid. Being Jewish is so hard, it's so painful, it's so difficult, it's so oppressive. So the message their kids got was not a message of Mesiras Nefesh, of how much this means to my parents. Instead, they got the message of, this is tough, who wants this? In our own ways, we deliver our own messages to our kids of Shver zu sein a Yid. When we kvetch about tuition and we kvetch about how difficult it is, and we say at the Shabbos table, all I want to do is get through the meal so I go to sleep. Those are messages, that nonverbal messages even, that we're delivering. So the first strategy to bring spirituality into the lives of our teens is to bring spirituality into our own lives and model it for them. That they should see when we're inspired sometimes and we want to sing and we want to dance. And we want to be Oved Hashem. They want to see that when things are difficult in the community that we turn to our Tehillim or to our Siddur. Let them see that. Let them see instead of policing our kids during Shmona Esrei. Let's have a shmooze with them on the way to shul about what davening is going to be like today and then model what a Shmona Esrei should look like. Let's do it ourselves first and lead by example. It's the first strategy. The second is to think outside the box. What are the opportunities that we can plug our kids into? Chesed opportunities. What are the opportunities to make our Shabbos table different, unconventional? The opportunities for us to even give mishalim for our kids. I'll give you another great one from Rabbi Karsh. Again, my mentor in Tefillah gives an incredible analogy. It's a visualization that he heard from Rebbetzin Fegi Twersky in Milwaukee. You can use your own visualizations, and our kids can use their own visualizations. But this is a visualization that he told me once at a Midwest NCSY Yarchei Kala, and it worked for me when I'm feeling zoned in enough to actually employ it. What's going through our minds during those seconds, those nanoseconds, before we take our 3 steps forward for Shmona Esrei? What are we thinking about? So Rebbetzin Fegi Twersky, and repeated by Rabbi Yoshua Karsh, explains as follows. He says, picture yourself standing before a magnificent palace. Picture these magnificent mahogany doors, finely crafted, standing before you 20, 30 feet high, that are going to open up to this incredible palace. And the mahogany door is open, and before you, this magnificent marble floor, and chandeliers like you've never seen, and gold trim, and platinum all over the room. And there is nobody there. It's just you. The far end is the king. You don't have to picture what the king looks like. Maybe picture the king's throne. But you have an audience with the king, with your Father in heaven. An opportunity to tell him how you feel, to thank him, to praise him, to ask for what you need. And that's what we can visualize before we begin Shmona Esrei. Or whatever visualization might work for you of how you picture God. Maybe it's not a magnificent palace. Maybe it's a little closet. The more intimate conversation. But whatever visualization it is, don't be afraid to actually employ them ourselves and then have conversations with our children about them. Let them see that this means something to us. Let them see that we're employing some of our creative energy, some of our juices to making a difference in their lives spiritually. That we're thinking outside the box. And the last thing is, plug them into opportunities because we can't do it ourselves and our schools can't do it themselves. Opportunities where they can connect with role models. Opportunities where they can be accepted for who they are, loved unconditionally and embraced. Nationally in NCSY, we are, as Avi mentioned, working over the course of the next 5 years to double the number of kids on whom we have an impact. And we're taking a lot of time and attention to how we define impact. Impact in the yeshiva day school realm and impact in the public school realm. Because we have 2 simultaneous crises going on in America today. There's a crisis of spirituality in our own community, where our kids know how there are more kids learning Torah today in actual schools, yeshiva day schools and the such, than ever before in Jewish history. The quantity of people learning Torah is unprecedented, ever. but the quality of their spiritual experience, the way they actually connect to God, is at a terrible low. And when our kids go off to college campuses, if they don't go to Yeshiva University, Turo, another Judaic studies institution, then the chances of them genuinely staying spiritually connected are greatly diminished. And if they don't go to a campus if they go into a secular campus, they're not going where there's a JLIC or another inspirational role model that they can connect to, again, greatly diminished. But our own graduates of yeshiva high schools, overall, even including those to Yeshiva University, Turo, etc., and even including those who go to campuses where there's JLIC, predominantly, the Pew study says 18% of those are not even defining themselves as Orthodox just a few years later, and many more are defining themselves as Orthodox but aren't practicing, and many more than that are defining themselves as Orthodox but aren't feeling, because that's the challenge for us, so it's of course the challenge for our kids. That's one crisis in America today that NCSY is trying to do something about, and the other crisis you know about full well. It's the other part, the major part of the Pew study that says 72% intermarriage in the last 12 years outside the Orthodox community. That assimilation is rampant, and it's getting harder and harder because the low-hanging fruit, the conservative movement, those kids who at least know how to read Hebrew, at least know what Shabbat is, who used to make up the bread and butter of NCSY's public school recruits. The conservative movement has hollowed out. Their numbers are down. They're redefining their mission on an ongoing basis. They're not sure what they believe. They changed USY International Convention. You may have read this, was this week. And at USY International Convention, the kids made a subtle change. In their minds, it was subtle. But a subtle change to say that interdating among regional board members and national board members in USY is no longer prohibited. Now it happens to be, these are kids who actually want kids to date Jewish. They were trying to take something that was phrased negatively, thou shalt not, and phrase it positively. We value the ideal of Jews dating and marrying Jews. But by changing that language, they've de facto then said regional board members, national officers in USY can date Gentiles and still be leaders in the organization. And so that subtle change was caught by JTA, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, and now you're going to see all over the internet and appearing in Jewish newspapers. Because that change represents the fact that they're not sure what they believe. That's a digression. But the reality is that as orthodoxy gets stronger in numbers and conservative gets weaker in numbers, and the left, reform and unaffiliated, get stronger in numbers, we have these two challenges. And so we've laid out a 5-year strategic plan of how NCSY is going to double the number of kids that we impact in the next 5 years. Not double the number of kids that we see, but double the number of kids that we impact through high-quality experiences. What are we doing for yeshiva day school students? In co-ed yeshiva day schools, in places that we traditionally haven't drawn heavily from, but they're experiencing the same crisis of spirituality in Frisch and SAR and Ramaz and Kushner and Hafter and Eula in LA, and Ida Crown in Chicago. In single-gender yeshiva day schools, who, again, their parents, we care enough. I send my kids to single-gender yeshiva high schools. But I know that the crisis of spirituality is not any different in a single-gender yeshiva high school than it is in a co-ed high school. What meaningful experiences are we creating for our kids? So in NCSY, we're targeting those schools as well to launch pilot projects over the next 5 years. First in the next 2 years, pilot projects for these two audiences. Co-ed yeshiva high schools, single-gender yeshiva high schools, to say, what can we do to engage an audience that's traditionally not been engaged by NCSY? The co-ed yeshiva high school audiences, we get 5%, if that, from Hafter, Ramaz, Kushner, SAR, Frisch. In the single-gender yeshiva high schools, we work with those kids in the summer, but not during the year. The kids at TABC and Mayanot and MTA and Central and DRS and SKA and Skokie Yeshiva and Eula should have been in this example. I meant Shalheven in the co-ed example in Los Angeles. We see those kids in the summer. They make up the majority of NCSY Kolel, of Michlalet, of Give, of our single-gender summer programs. But during the year, what's happening with them? And what pilots can we launch in conjunction with those schools to think creatively for how we're going to address this crisis of spirituality? And another 3 pilots in the realm of public school outreach. You can ask me about if you'd like. But really, in this conversation, we're doubling down our efforts to raise more money, to structure our management more strategically, and to shut down programs that we think are nice, but are not having the degree of impact that they need to be having in order for us to accomplish our goal of doubling the number of kids that we impact in the next 5 years. In many cases, it's the public school kids who are wide-eyed, who feel this sense of spirituality and a connection that we in our own communities don't feel. And we need to reawaken it by thinking strategically and creatively about it. There was a young woman I worked with in Midwest NCSY when I was regional director there, a young woman named Morgan, who went on TJJ, our hallmark NCSY summer program in Israel for public school kids. This will be my closing story. And Morgan went on TJJ and she came back so inspired, so ready to connect, but then she went back to her public school in St. Louis, Missouri, and it dissipated, as these things sometimes do, without ongoing relationships. So one day in November, she wakes up and she says, I need to connect to that feeling that I had in the summer. It's gone. She couldn't concentrate the rest of the day, thinking through Spanish class and history class and trigonometry. What is she going to do to reawaken the spirituality that she felt in the summer? And finally, at the end of the day, it occurs to her she's going to bring her bencher to school the next day, and she's going to bench. And that's in public school, and that's what's going to reconnect her to that spiritual feeling that she felt on TJJ in the summer. She's so excited. She goes home, she gets her bencher, she puts it in her backpack. She can't wait till the next day. The whole morning she can't concentrate either. But this time, she's so excited for lunch, to go to the cafeteria. I hope she ate kosher food, I really do. But to go to the cafeteria, to eat and to bench. So she went, takes out her bencher at the end of her meal. Her friends say, what are you doing? She said, you could go ahead. I need another couple minutes. So they leave her, and there she is, sitting in the cafeteria of Clayton North High School in St. Louis, Missouri, with her NCSY bencher in front of her. So we're very good at NCSY about teaching kids to bench. But what we don't do is teach them that you don't have to sing it. So here she goes. She opens it up. Baruch atah Hashem. And from behind her she hears, Elokeinu melech haolam. She turns around. You're Jewish. You're Jewish. Neither of them can believe it because they sit next to each other in homeroom every morning, but they didn't even realize the other one was Jewish, let alone that the other one knew how to bench. And so they finished benching together. And from that point forward, they had a chavrusa in benching for every lunch period for the entire year. That's the magic of what one can influence another. Awaken a connection. Public school kids often feel that wide-eyed openness. Our own kids don't. They've grown up with it. Baruch Hashem, they've grown up with it. But unless we're willing to employ strategies that will actually make our kids be as excited to bench as Morgan was in St. Louis, strategies of ourselves modeling it, of thinking outside the box and connecting them to experiences through NCSY and other organizations that will help our kids' horizons be expanded and connect them to kids who they otherwise would not have the opportunity to be exposed to, then this crisis of spirituality in our community is only going to get worse. So we're committed to that effort. And each of us in our own households need to be equally committed. Thank you all very much. We do have a couple of minutes for questions. Yeah. Very well said. I think there are others from the OU who are listening, and I think we should absolutely make that an agenda item for discussion. Yes. Excellent. So that's a good suggestion. We don't have all the chachma in the world at the OU or in NCSY. We grant that YU also shares it with us. YUTorah.org is a great destination. I say that tongue-in-cheek with my Rebbe Rav Schechter in the room. That's unquestionably there are many addresses, but as much as it's the internet is not so difficult to find. It's not so difficult to find places to go. But the point is fully taken that the initiative should come from us to share those opportunities outward. Yes. Right. So it's a great question about, for the benefit of the camera, for the question about starting earlier than NCSY traditionally starts. The truth is for many decades, NCSY had a very strong junior NCSY program that started in fifth grade or sixth grade. And in some regions, it is still strong. But in many ways, in the last couple of decades, we moved away from that, focused on, I think high school years are the prime years for kids to be making decisions that affect the rest of their lives. So we've been focusing on the prime years. I'll tell you the downside to that, in addition to the ones you know, though. The downside to that is it's become harder and harder to recruit high school students who have increasingly busier and busier lives. And if we can engage them in 6th, 7th, or 8th grade, then it's going to be that much easier to retain them later. And in addition, kids' maturity and decision making is now, in certain ways, they're much more immature than they've ever been, but in other ways, they're exposed to so much more than they've ever been. And one of our pilot areas actually will be expanding back in certain regions, expanding in the junior NCSY realm to see what sorts of programs NCSY can implement, and that if it works, if in fact we engage these students effectively as 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th graders, to replicate that elsewhere. It doesn't fully address your question, though. And I think to fully address your question, I think I want to come back to the point that I made about modeling, because it's not going to be possible, I think, for us always to have at every age of potential engagement exactly the right organization. We can each work to start it. And hopefully, NCSY can be a piece of that solution. But some communities' needs are different than other communities' needs, and some households' needs are different than other households' needs. And I think. I think in many cases, I've had so many conversations with parents about the spirituality challenges that they're having with their children, and I'm certainly as guilty of this as anyone. And they look everywhere else but themselves. They're looking to blame the shul. They're looking to blame the school. They're looking to blame the media. They're looking to blame the internet. They're looking to blame everywhere else except starting at home. And obviously, it's easier for me to say this to you. Your daughter's 3.5. So I don't think the problem starts at home. I think, but as you're here, you're asking the right questions to say, what am I going to need to be doing when my daughter's in 4th grade, in 3rd grade, in 2nd grade? I think the answer is partially finding the organizations that you can connect her to, and I hope NCSY can be a part of that. But it's also what strategies am I employing? What sort of modeling am I doing? Okay, I think that's all the time we have for questions. Thank you all once again.